All right, so topic 2 in our unit biological diversity is habitat and lifestyle. So, all right, so we're going to talk about the niche and what makes an organism special. So like I said, you may hear it pronounced niche. You may also hear it pronounced niche. I've always been taught niche, so I'm going to continue to call it niche. So when we talk about an environment, that's the area or conditions in which an organism lives. But when we talk about a niche, it includes where an organism lives, it includes its habitat, but it also includes what it does. So what is this organism's role? All right, so we'll use the poplar tree as an example here. So a poplar tree, its habitat, in this case, it's a mountain forest outside of Banff. And some of its roles include it absorbs light for photosynthesis, it removes carbon dioxide from the air and releases oxygen into the air, so photosynthesis. It also provides food and shelter for a variety of organisms. The roots as well will stabilize the soil from erosion. The ground will get covered with leaves in the fall, and then those nutrients go back into the soil. And another one could be that it removes water and nutrients from the soil. So lots and lots of roles we can see here. Some more to continue could be any dead and decaying matter like dead leaves and so on that are on the ground are then decomposed by decomposers. All right, so it's everything that organism does in that environment. Its role. That's what a niche is. Next, variation and competition. So when resources are plentiful, many species are going to share them, such as resources like food, water, sunlight. But when resources become scarce, organisms that depend on them, they're going to have to compete for it. So this competition, this is the struggle among individual organisms for access to a limited resource. And it could be food, it could be territory, it could be water, and so on. And this competition, it's going to occur between members of the same species. It's also going to occur between different species as well. So variations between individuals may give one of them an advantage. So this is where the variations come into play again. So again, it's between members of the same or different species. An example could be that one may be able to tolerate cold winters better. One may be faster or better able to avoid predators. It's the one that's better adapted that's going to be able to survive and reproduce. And for future generations to survive, the less successful may have to change to a less desirable food source or move on to a different habitat. Or they might die off. So some species are going to avoid competition with more dominant species. So maybe they'll have to adapt to use a different food source, or maybe they will keep different habits or behaviors. So an example, the cougar versus a lynx. The cougar, they'll hunt large herbivores like deer, elk, bighorn sheep, and they're found in thick pine forests. Lynx, they can inhabit the same area as cougars, but they're gonna now, to avoid competition, they're gonna feed on the snowshoe hare. Another example is owls versus hawks. Owls avoid that competition with hawks by hunting at night. So again, it's a behavioral adaptation. And as organisms change to avoid or reduce competition, they are altering their niches. And this will eventually increase the variation within or between species. So here we're looking at warblers. These are small active birds. They've got sharp beaks adapted for capturing insects. And in the spruce forests of Canada, there are 5 warbler species that can coexist in the same tree. All right, so they're existing in the same tree but on different parts of the tree. So for example, the Cape May warbler here, exists on the top and the tips of the tree. The yellow-rumped warbler is more near the trunks and the lower branches and on the ground. The black-throated green warbler, this one here, is in the middle of the tree. The Blackburnian warbler is found at the outer tips from the middle to the top, and then the bay-breasted warbler is in the lower half of the tree. So we can see here that even though they're living on the same tree, they're still avoiding competition and so on by existing on different parts of that tree. All right, so we'll pause here and watch a couple videos here.
Sleek, lithe, and with acceleration speeds that can outstrip a Ferrari, cheetahs are the world's fastest land mammal. But why is it so important for cheetahs to be able to run so fast? Well, one of the cheetah's natural habitats are the savannas of Africa, where you can find lions and hyenas, who both compete with the cheetahs for prey, and sometimes even try to kill them for food. Cheetahs need to be able to outstrip their prey and their predators. To do so, they run very fast. A flexible spine and long legs give the cheetah the perfect shape and build for speed. Yet even within the species, some cheetahs can run faster than others. Which one of these cheetahs do you think will win the race for food? In nature, all organisms compete with each other for resources in order to survive. Competition between members of the same species is what makes organisms evolve. This theory of competition and survival of the fittest is called natural selection, and was originally proposed by Charles Darwin in his book On the Origin of Species in 1859. Different individuals show a wide degree of variation. He proposed that individuals with characteristics most suited to their environments are more likely to survive, reproduce, and pass on their characteristics. Meanwhile, individuals that are less well adapted to their environment might not survive and reproduce. Their less well adapted characteristics will eventually become removed from the population. This process causes species to change gradually and enables new species to eventually emerge. After it was published, On the Origin of Species caused a storm of controversy, and Charles Darwin was ridiculed. But his theory of natural selection is now widely accepted. During the 20th century, we discovered that the characteristics of an organism that are passed from one generation to the next are controlled by genes. Scientists were able to explain Darwin's theory of natural selection in terms of the selection of favorable genes. Natural selection can directly impact humans when it comes to treating diseases. The discovery of the antibiotic penicillin in 1928 was lauded as a great advancement in therapeutic medicine, and it soon became widely used. However, within just a few years, some bacteria could withstand the effects of penicillin. They had adapted a resistance to the antibiotic. These fitter bacteria survived, and in the late 20th century, bacteria populations began to emerge that were resistant to penicillin. Nowadays, antibiotics are used more sparingly, and scientists are attempting to find other ways to treat infections. But how do you suppose they can do this? So from this video, you should know that variation within a population means some individuals have an increased chance of survival and passing on characteristics onto their offspring. You have also learned that inherited antibiotic resistance in bacteria poses problems for modern medicine and is an example of adaptation and natural selection in action.
You probably noticed that they'll compete with one another for a meal. But this doesn't just happen with seagulls. It happens in every ecosystem around the world. Let's dive in and take a look at this behaviour in marine ecosystems. In order to survive, organisms need access to a range of living or biotic factors, such as food and mates. They also need non-living or abiotic factors, such as light and shelter. But in any ecosystem, these resources are limited. Because organisms of the same species need the same resources, they compete against one another to get them, such as these king crabs who will fight it out for food, shelter, or a mate. This type of relationship between organisms is known as competition. There is a constant struggle for survival in any ecosystem, and many organisms die, especially the young, old, and weak. But organisms don't need to fight one another to be in competition. These wrasse fish are in competition with one another just because they're all eating the same sea jelly, and this resource is limited. Shelter is just as important as finding food. Having outgrown his shell, this hairy red hermit crab fights another crab for his bigger shell. The bigger shell will provide more space for his growing body, as well as shelter and protection from predators. Competition also occurs when organisms mature and are ready to reproduce. These male Antarctic fur seals fight one another for territory on the beach, which gives them access to females for mating. Other species take a different approach. For example, a male pufferfish spends hours creating intricate patterns in the sand, known as crop circles. These are designed to attract a female pufferfish. If the male's skills are deemed worthy by the female, she'll lay eggs in the center of the crop circle. But it's important to note that competition occurs between organisms of different species too. Surgeonfish, for example, eat the same coral as parrotfish. Even though they're different species, they're still competing with one another for the same limited resource.
All right, so we're going to take a look at the two types of niches next. We'll start by talking about the broad niche. So the broad niche is when roles or characteristic activities are filled by a generalist organism. A generalist organism has generalized requirements and adaptations that allow it to survive in variable conditions and depend on a variety of food sources. So an example here in northern Canada, you'll find herds of caribou, millions of Arctic hare, and large carnivores like wolves and polar bears. So these animals are able to live here year-round, and therefore they have to be able to withstand daily and seasonal changes in temperature. They also have to be able to eat a variety of plants and animals because seasons and conditions are always changing. So they have adaptations that allow them to survive in the heat of the summer, but also in the freezing cold of the winter. So when we talk about a broad niche, we will see usually a generalist organism living in the broad niche. When we talk about a narrow niche, we will see specialization. So a narrow niche, it's a highly specialized role or characteristic activity undertaken by an organism in an ecosystem. And we'll see specialization, which are adaptations for surviving in very specific environments. So for example, in the tropics, temperatures and food supplies are very stable, and so therefore most organisms in the tropics will be specialists. They will have adaptations that make them very efficient at surviving in their own very specific environment. What this allows for is many different species can inhabit a single area, but it prevents any one species from spreading over a larger area. So what we see in the tropics is species will have lots of diversity, but their populations tend to remain low. So an example of a narrow niche and specialization is the lion-tailed macaque of India. So they're specialized to live in the forest canopy. They're not suited for life on the ground. But as forests are being cut down, this lion-tailed macaque has nowhere else to live, so they're facing endangerment. The last little bit here is on dependencies between species. So you've probably learned this in grade 7 when you were doing the unit Interactions and Ecosystems. So we talked about symbiotic relationships. This is an interaction between organisms of different species living in close proximity to each other in a relationship that lasts over time. So keep in mind, it's not a predator-prey relationship. Predator-prey is when the predator will consume the prey, and that's the end. This is a relationship between organisms of different species. They're living in close proximity to each other, and this relationship is lasting over time. And there's 3 types. There's parasitism, mutualism, and commensalism. So we'll talk about parasitism first. One species benefits, that's the parasite. The other species is harmed, that's the host. An example could be like a mosquito and humans. So it is still a symbiotic relationship because one species is benefiting. The other species, which is the host, is being harmed, not being killed, not necessarily being killed, but they are being weakened because the parasites are taking nutrients from the host. And also the parasite doesn't want to kill the host because they want to live on the host or in the host, right? So they want to keep the host living so that they can keep thriving off of the host. Mutualism, that's a relationship in which both species benefit. So for example, bees or insects and flowers, the insects get nectar from the flower, which is a food source, and then the flowers benefit because these insects are pollinators and will help seed dispersal. Another example, clownfish, sea anemone, this is mutualistic. Clownfish gets protection and the sea anemone gets food from the clownfish. I believe the sea anemone also gets cleaned by the clownfish. And then commensalism, one species benefits, the other neither benefits nor is harmed. The example here, the remora fish attaches to a shark. There's the remora fish, there's the shark. The remora will use the shark for transportation, and it'll also eat any leftover food that's left over from the shark. So the remora is benefiting, the shark is not benefiting, nor is it getting harmed. So that kind of relationship is called commensalism. All right, so just a quick chart to summarize those three types of symbiosis. So when both are benefiting, that's called mutualism. One benefits, one is unaffected, that's commensalism. Another example here is whales and barnacles. And then when one species benefits, the other is harmed, that's parasitism. Another example here is the dog and the tick. The tick is the parasite, the dog is the host. All right, so we do have a video here on ecological relationships, which I'll probably play at the end. Lastly is life in the extreme. So there are organisms that can live in extreme environments because they're adapted to live in those extreme environments. So for example, the Antarctic springtail can survive in extreme cold. Within its body and in its tissues, it can produce a type of antifreeze, which allows it to survive to temperatures to like minus 35 degrees Celsius. Another one is snow algae. The cell membranes of snow algae are adapted to cold temperatures. They still make their own food by photosynthesis, but they also produce this reddish pigment that protects against the sun's damaging rays. All right, so I'm just gonna pause here.
I really did not like sandboxes as a kid. It's not that I have a problem with sand, or sand on the beach, or sand castles, just sand boxes. See, as a little kid, I'd play with something, then I'd kind of forget about it, and then rediscover it, and it'd be all new again. This is what happened with my sandbox. Except, when I rediscovered it, the sand had all these tiny holes in it. My dad was with me and exclaimed, "Why, look at that, your sandbox is full of antlions." Perhaps my dad should not have assumed that I knew what antlions were. I eventually figured out what they were later on, and it makes sense now because my father really loves insects. Antlions are insects. In their adult form, they sort of look, in my personal opinion, like a less cool version of a dragonfly. They are not a dragonfly. But in their larva stage, they look, well, not like many things I can compare it to. They have these mandibles and they make these sand pit traps. And then they wait with their mandibles just showing above the surface. When an ant or other small insect walks over their sandpit, they drag it in. They pull the ant underground, biting it and injecting it with enzymes to digest it in order to consume the ant's juices. I also have learned by watching them that they toss sand at their ant victim too if they need help subduing it before they drag them under. Thankfully, antlions are small. In fact, doodlebug is evidently another name for these things. I'm not exactly sure how you go from antlion to doodlebug, but okay. It's all relative. They're bad news for an ant, because the antlion is a predator of the ant. The ant is their prey. That's an ecological relationship right there. And that's what we're going to talk about, ecological relationships. Typically, if we were to graph the predator and prey populations in our example, when the population of ants in this confined area increase, it is likely that the antlions, which are the predators, also will increase over time because they have more food to eat. However, if the antlions increase too much, there won't be enough ants, which are the prey, to feed on. So the antlions will decrease. You can see that relationship in this predator and prey graph. In most ecosystems, predator and prey graphs go up and down frequently. It cycles. Also, just because this antlion is a predator doesn't mean that this is the only role it plays. An antlion can get eaten by a bird. Now the antlion has just become the bird's prey. Competition is also another relationship to consider. Antlions are consumers, which means they have to eat other things. They can't make their own food. They have to compete with other antlions for this food too. This food being their prey, the ants. This example shows competition for a limiting biotic factor. And they're not just competing with other antlions for this biotic factor. They may have to compete with completely different species in the area that are also predators of ants too. For example, jumping spiders like ants. You know, it's not just consumers that compete. Producers, like this plant, make their own food, but that does not mean they don't have to deal with competition. For example, this plant here is competing for this limiting abiotic factor, light. Symbiotic relationships are specific types of relationships where different species live together. Parasitism is an example of a symbiotic relationship where one organism benefits and the other is harmed. An example? Well, you know, I love dogs. Petunia is the cat person. When my family took in our rescue dog, she was 4 months old at the time. We learned from the vet that she would need to be treated for fleas and hookworms. We were able to give her medicine to treat these parasites. A good thing because these parasites can hurt the dog by feeding on their blood. A parasite is an organism that gets its nutrients from another organism and causes harm to its host. They can live inside or on their host. Mutualism is an example of a symbiotic relationship where both organisms involved benefit. You really need to look up a video about acacia ants and acacia trees because this is a fascinating example. See, some species of acacia trees form these hollow thorns which provide housing to acacia ants. Some species even provide a nectar for food for these ants. So what does this tree get in return? Protection. I'd hate to be a type of consumer that eats acacia trees because if it has acacia ants, the ants will come out of the thorns and attack the consumer. They'll even destroy plants that try to grow close to the acacia tree so the ants can eliminate the tree's competition. Nice mutual relationship between the acacia tree and the acacia ant. The last symbiotic relationship we'll mention is commensalism. This one is interesting because in this relationship, one organism benefits and the other is neither helped nor harmed. It has a neutral effect. Some species of barnacles and whales are a great example. Many barnacle species can attach themselves to moving things, like a boat or a whale. On a free whale ride, the barnacles get a lot of access to food since they are filter feeders and the whale may travel to nutrient-rich waters. In this particular example, the barnacles benefit, but neither help nor harm the whale, so this would be commensalism. But I do like to remind my students that sometimes there's more to the story with a relationship labeled as commensalism, and sometimes what we thought was a completely neutral effect may not always be in every case. So why do all these relationships matter anyway? Well, one reason is that these interactions can make significant impacts on populations of different species living together. That means if the population of a certain species is threatened by human activity, for example, it can affect more than just that one species. Scientists continue to learn about new ecological relationships all the time. Well, that's it for the Amoeba Sisters, and we remind you to stay curious.
All right, so after our lesson today, there's 2 study.com activities to do, and both of them are going to be found under modules. So what you do is you're going to click on the link, and the link will take you to the study.com page. There you're going to create a login, and then you'll be able to access those 2 activities.